We begin with simmering tensions between Russia and the West over Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky declared, quote, a day of unity on Wednesday amid U.S. claims of an imminent Russian invasion. The tensions are heightened as world leaders forge ahead with talks. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz earlier met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow, part of an intense diplomatic scramble. Moscow says it seeks to negotiate a new treaty that would satisfy all countries' security concerns, particularly a written assurance that NATO will halt its eastward expansion. But earlier on Tuesday, Russian Ministry of Defense says some of its troops are returning to bases after completing military exercises. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for diplomacy, adding that the possibility of war is something Europe cannot accept. So, is it possible for all parties to dial back tensions in the coming days? Insights from our panelists. More on the Ukraine crisis. We are joined in Kiev, Peter Zomayev, who is the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. In Moscow, Pavel Felgenhauer, a Russian political and defense analyst. In Shanghai, Zhao Long, professor from the Center for Russian and Central Studies from Shanghai Institute for International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Things are happening by hours as we speak. Let's try to catch up with the latest. There are so many different sources that are trying to bring out information. It's very hard to believe which is right, which is wrong, which is false, and which is true, who are fabricating and who are providing real information. I hope with your insights we can try to clarify at least some of the logics behind all of these chaos, apparent chaos. So let me go to you, Mr. Zomayev. Now, the president of your country had been asking, when he was asked by journalists about the so-called imminent invasion of Ukraine by Wednesday, he said, give me more information if you have. Who is actually behind this? What do I need to know? Now, that's very interesting, isn't it? We see that being circled around for quite some time. Do you have any information about where does that information, quote unquote, come from?
Well, it comes from the White House. You know, it's been Joe Biden's strategy, the American president's strategy all along to to ring the alarm bells and insist on an imminent invasion of Ukraine in what has been called megaphone diplomacy, designed to put Russia on the defensive, and at the same time to unite Western countries, members of NATO and European Union, in their response to Russia and its aggression against Ukraine. The recalcitrant members, such as Germany, for example, that's been really hard to get Germany on board with the White House's position. And Joe Biden can, with some justification, claim that he's been able to succeed doing so. Mr. Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, was here just yesterday in Kiev. He is here in Moscow today, meeting with Vladimir Putin, and he's been saying pretty harsh things as far as what Germany will do should Russia invade. So that's been like part of the American strategy all along. It's created a little bit of a tension, to say the least, between Ukraine and America. And Vladimir Zelensky has been at pains to keep Ukrainians calm and free of too much stress.
Seems that similar questions have also been asked by the Russian side, Mr. Felgenhauer. As far as I understand, according to Itatas news agency, the deputy representative of Russia at the United Nations actually did not confirm when being asked about information regarding so-called Wednesday invasion that have been circling in the media for some time. And he asked what is actually behind the quote-unquote, timing. Mr. Felgenhauer, how do you take that question?
Well, this is kind of normal when wars kind of in a pre-war or close-to-war situation. 19th century military thinker Karl von Clausewitz called it the fog of war, and that's a fog, informational fog, when there's very conflicting information coming in a war situation. It's very hard to figure out what's really happening. Of course, the Russian official position is that Russia is not, has no intention to attack anyone. Russia is a peaceful nation. The exercises that were happening were just a kind of move to defend Russian borders, and it was happening on Russian territory. And of course, yesterday, during a meeting between President Putin and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, it was announced that a number of exercises of Russian military will be completed and the troops will return to permanent bases, though other exercises will continue. So right now we're in a kind of ambiguous situation. There's been official reports and footage of troops moving to home bases, but of course there's also reports of other forces moving out, and not so much about Ukraine, like say sending anti-carrier aircraft to Syria. So we're not out of the woods. It's still a very tense situation, but it will not last long. I'm sure that in the coming week or a week and a half, the situation will somehow be resolved. I believe, I hope that there is going to be a genuine de-escalation.
What do you mean by likely to be resolved? What is backing your confidence, quote unquote?
Well, the Russian military, not only around Ukraine, but the entire country, at a super high state of readiness, sort of cocked and loaded. And they can't stay in such a position for continuously. They'll have to step down, and I believe that's going to be more or less a strategic decision made if there are no sudden changes. And so there's going to be a step down. That's not that the situation is resolved. This is just de-escalation for the time being, but without a comprehensive political solution. We're going to have the same crisis maybe in half a year, and maybe it will be even worse than today.
Yeah. Mr. Zhao, how do you see the apparent crisis? I'm using plural forms because it seems that there are crises between Russia and Kiev, apparently, and there's also crisis about the trust between Kiev and maybe the United States, as the president of Ukraine has been asking the U.S. president to visit Ukraine if there is imminent crisis facing the nation. And of course, the White House turned down that invitation, saying the president is not going to make that visit. So there's another layer that among Western countries themselves, Europeans, particularly France, Germany, and also the United States. And then there's also, of course, NATO. Meanwhile, there's also the bigger issue about Eurasia, the role of Russia and how likely things are likely to proceed. Mr. Zhao, it's a very complex picture.
Yes, indeed. I think we have seen in last few days the early results from the shuttle diplomacy made by the leaders of European countries. So as you mentioned, the latest news shows that some Russian troops is willing to withdraw from the Black Sea region. I think it will create some condition for the next round of negotiation between Russia and NATO. But however, the development of the whole situation is quite difficult to escape the narrative of a major power game between Russia and the United States. So that's why I think the Normandy model of talks without the participation of the United States are quite difficult to produce some effective results. And we should have a more observation on the U.S. how U.S. evaluates and how U.S. would adjust its policy with regard to the Ukraine crisis. But overall, I think although the war worries are rising, but the unwillingness to have some real conflict it still prevails. So everybody is now setting quite a kind of a tone of a possible war. So they can also be viewed as an opportunity for them to setting up their own agenda and goals. So I agree with the colleague just mentioned. I think they will continue to showing up their muscles in the military level, but will continue to also to having more pressure, warnings against each other. But the new round of political dialogue may also be restarted in the near future.
Mr. Zelensky, when there are two big, players fighting, it is the grass that hurts the most, I guess, as they say, according to traditional idioms. So, what is the current atmosphere in Ukraine, where you are, about the relationship between Russia and the United States, and Ukraine apparently being caught in the middle somewhat?
Well, it has been caught in the middle for quite some time. Ukrainians are under no illusion that the U.S. and the West will be welcoming them, for example, to NATO. That prospect has been put behind. Actually, just moved away further and further, and that is actually part of Vladimir Putin's strategy. He really knows that Russia is not going to expand to include Ukraine in the next few years. When you ask about the mood of Ukrainians, it is full of resolve. Contrary to some media reports that planes full of oligarchs and rich businessmen have left Kiev over the last few days, and that actually is true. Most Ukrainians have nowhere to go. Most are digging in. They're ready to face the enemy, so to speak, and they've been at it for, don't forget, the conflict has been going on since 2014. Yeah. Russia has, in fact, been occupying Ukraine, has, in fact, been constantly invading Ukraine by virtue of holding Crimea and the east of Ukraine. So that is something to be aware of. Ukrainians have been at war for many, many years already.
Mr. Zhao, we have 30 seconds left. Anything to say, respond to the other guests, and also wrapping up?
Well, I think Ukraine has already included its desire for the membership of the EU and the NATO into its constitution. So I think it's quite difficult for the Ukraine leaders to make policy changes in this regard. So there's a very few options for the Ukraine government except to rely on the Western protection and to have more dialogue with the NATO and the EU. Okay. So that's why I think all parties should, in this classic geopolitical game, should have more flexibility and pragmatism for their agenda setting and policy making.
Well, wrapping up today's discussion, time is up. Zhao Long, Peter Zelensky, and Pavel Felgenhauer, really appreciate it. Thank you for your insights.